Good morning. It's a blessing that we have an opportunity again to be together to worship God and to give praise and glory to Him. And I'm thankful also that we're getting to start a new series and a new study and get to have a chance to study something that's going to be really interesting that I think we're going to get a lot out of. It actually comes at a very good time for us having just come out of a series about the heart around Valentine's Day, for us now to be discussing the book of Ruth. The title of this morning's lesson is actually Introducing Ruth. Ruth 1 through 5 is going to be our primary text, but we're really going to be just looking at getting a basic introduction for what this book is going to be all about, what this story involves and entails, how we can best be servants of God when we emulate different aspects of Ruth in our life. If you want to go ahead and turn over in your Bibles to Ruth 1 through 5, that is going to be our primary text once again. We're going to try to get an idea of what time frame this is. We're going to try to get an idea of who exactly we're talking about and what. If you will, read along with me there, beginning Ruth 1, beginning in verse 1. I also have it on the screen behind me, and there should be a Bible in a pew near you if you didn't remember to bring one this morning. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Epaphrites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. As I said a minute ago, I want us to take a brief look this morning at first the time period, the occasion at where Ruth comes into play. And second, I'm wanting us to look at the place, or places would be more particular as to where we're talking about, where the scene is going to be taken out of. And third, I'm wanting us to look at the different people. Now, we won't be introducing this morning every character in the book of Ruth, or every person that's recorded in the book of Ruth, but primarily the ones that's going to be involved in this first section. And we'll look at the other characters as they come up. But I am wanting us to get a basic beginning point to launch into this story. This story is one of love. It's one of happiness, of joy, of faithfulness. It's a truly inspiring story. It is one that can help motivate you to have a love like Ruth had for Naomi. It can be one that would motivate you to be as strong and care so much for your family as Naomi did for Ruth. It is an amazing story of responsibility, and it's one that can greatly affect our lives. But to begin to understand this story, we need to know when exactly it was taking place. Unfortunately, there is no exact year, month, day that was given as to when it was, and who exactly was the specific judge at this time. One thing we can gather from the beginning is that this was in the period of the judges, that this was in the time of the judges. So the book in the Bible previous to Ruth here, the book of Judges, we could take Ruth and put it in the middle there somewhere. Some would say that because of the genealogy that you find at the end of Ruth, that it'd be best placed around the Jephthah, Samson judges' time. Although you'll see others that will say Gideon and some other judges as well, but we can know for sure that this was in the time of Judges. The only real difficulty that you'll find there is that the period of the judges spanned over 3 centuries. So that's quite a large time frame there, roughly 3 centuries, to find this. But even though we don't know the exact time, this gives us a huge chunk of understanding as to what was going on. During the period of the judges, you didn't have a king over Israel. Technically, there was a king, but Israel just didn't seem to fully recognize who that king was. The king was God. And we find that when we get into 1 Samuel and they start demanding a king. there was specific people called judges that helped to govern Israel and to be there for Israel in times of need. We don't need to understand these judges as the sense that they are today. They were not men in black robes or women in black robes that sat behind an elevated place and made decisions as to trivial cases. These judges were warriors. They were generals. They were people that rose up and saved Israel in times of war, in times of need. They helped to bring Israel along. It would usually happen after Israel had fallen away from God. Throughout the period of the judges, you see a circle taking place. It would start at the top where God and Israel were in a good relationship together. They were doing what they would need to be towards Him, and He was taking care of them. And then, for whatever reason, they would turn away from God, perhaps to idols, perhaps to other people, perhaps they would stop doing something they needed to be doing. And at that point, God would send someone to punish them, like the Philistines, for example. And the Philistines would war against Israel, and Israel would lose. And they would cry out to God and say, God, save us, help us. And He would respond that you've turned away from me. They would turn back to God and He would send a judge. They would conquer and once again start this cycle all over again. You see this take place over and over and over again in the period of the judges. Now the reason I really wanted to bring this up was that it's interesting to look at this time period in connection with Ruth. Because at a time when there was betrayal, at a time when there was a lack of faithfulness, at a time when there was not love being shown, you have this account take place. Another little bit of information that we need to know to understand the circumstance of what happened is that there was a famine. Now that doesn't give us any key to the exact timing. Nothing that I've ever found in research has ever shown that there was a recorded famine at this time, so it tells us it was at this year and at this place. However, it does give us an understanding as to the circumstance. It did give us a little bit of understanding as to what was taking place and caused them to leave Israel. It is probable that at one of these times when Israel was turning away from God, there was a famine in the land. That was not something that was uncommon. And it is very likely that this is one of those such circumstances. And when there was a famine in the land, the family of Elimelech left. They decided to seek elsewhere. Something we need to understand is that at this time, in this place, and still in that place, even now today, while we consider first what natural causes might have caused a famine, or what natural things might have caused this horrible tragedy, and then at the end result say, but of course God was in control of everything, that is completely backwards from their mindset. They would first look to that this was from God. That would be the first thing to spark into their mind and the first thought that would come to their head, that this was God either punishing us or blessing us. And then they would give an afterthought as to the physical causes. So whenever there is this famine in Israel, and Elimelech and his family and Naomi, when they leave to go over to Edom, they were trying to flee away from God's wrath or God's punishment. That's how they would have viewed it. This loss of rainfall would be very devastating to the crop harvests that are found there where they were living. Without rain, you couldn't have crops. Now, to better understand this a little bit, we need to understand Bethlehem of Judah a little better. It was located around 5 miles south of Jerusalem. This area was very vulnerable to whatever climate they might be having at the time, because there wasn't a good resource of water there nearby. They had to bring in the water from elsewhere. There wasn't any watering springs to water the crops. They had to rely on their cisterns. So when this famine comes, they're up the creek without a paddle. They have nothing they can do. You can't grow crops without water. Now, as a parallel to that, let's look over at Moab. Moab was a region of adequate rainfall. There was numerous wadis. It had very porous soil. It was a gold mine for farming, for agriculture. For someone who was living in Bethlehem, lacking water, and was used to getting their income by grain farming, by grapes and fruit of the vine, this would seem like the feasible idea, the right thing to do. But there is some more things we need to understand. If you were in our Genesis class this morning, we spoke briefly about Moab and Edom. We spoke briefly about the Moabites and their connection with the Edomites and the connection with the rest of Israel and how it all fits in. It is not a good thing for an Israelite to be leaving Israel, fleeing to Moab. That would not have been viewed as taking a leisurely stroll or a vacation. It could have very well been viewed as treason, as running away from your God, your nation, fleeing to the enemy. It was not completely uncommon for things like this to take place. It wasn't so unheard of that it would be shocking when someone did leave, but it still was a shock. And one thing we're going to see tonight is that when they end up coming back, Ruth and Naomi, they stir up the whole town by them coming back and having been away at Moab. This trip was not one that would be taken lightly. They would have to go up to Jerusalem, over to the Jordan, cross the Jordan, then go up again north. This would be somewhere around a 70 to 100 mile journey. This would be somewhere around a week-long trek for them to make. It's a pretty good little move. Not something, once again, to be taken lightly. So, time period of the Judges, we're going to have them starting off in Bethlehem of Judah, where they were from, which is going to be interesting. That's the same place where we're going to see David born at, the same place that Jesus was born in. And here their forefathers were also born there as well. So they're going to start in Bethlehem, and they're going to trek this to Moab. Specifically, it's described in one place as the plains of Moab. That word is the same word that's used when describing the country of Moab. It means field, area, place. It could be descriptive of a specific area north of Moab proper where there was a lot of farming taking place. Yet, they spent 10 years here in Moab before heading back to Bethlehem. So, we've got a little bit of an idea of the time and the place. Now we're going to look a little bit at the people. First person that would naturally need to be brought up is Elimelech. Elimelech is the leader of this household. He's the father. He's the husband. He is going to be the first one to die, though, as well. Elimelech, after leading his family over to Moab, dies, leaving his wife Naomi and his 2 sons. Specifically, not only were they described as being from Bethlehem in Judah, they are also described by the word Epaphraite. This, turn over to Genesis chapter 35 with me. Genesis chapter 35 and verse 19. This is perhaps descriptive of an area or a geographical location around Bethlehem. It's perhaps just another way of saying Bethlehem, but we see it used quite a lot in connection with Bethlehem. One such occasion is Genesis 35 and verse 19. So Rachel died, and she was buried on the way to Epaphrath, that is, Bethlehem. So this seems to be the same area, and whenever it's other people are crossing by Bethlehem in Genesis as well, we see it also referred to there as Epaphrath. So he's described as an Epaphraite from Bethlehem of Judah. He's described as being the husband of Naomi. He's having 2 children. Unfortunately, we only hear about Elimelech a little bit at the beginning of this story. We're not told about what kind of person he was. There is quite a bit of questioning, and something we'll deal with later on this evening when everybody comes back tonight to hear a little bit more into the story. If it was something evil that Elimelech and his two sons, Mahalan and Chilion, had done that had caused him to die. It's very possible that they were evil people. Nothing in the text directly indicates that. One thing that's of interest is that whenever Ruth and Naomi come back to Bethlehem, people call her Naomi, which is a name with good connotations, as if she was being blessed. And she tells them not to call her by that name, but to call her by a different name, which means bitterness, because God had judged against her by her losing her sons and her husband. Perhaps it was that they sinned. Perhaps it was the trespass of leaving God's land and fleeing over to Moab. Perhaps it was giving up on God and running away. The gods of Moab were believed to be gods of fertility in the land, which worked out pretty well because it was fertile ground. And the practices of the Moabites in worshiping was very common to the way that worship was done by the other Canaanite idols. There was a lot of cultic prostitution that was done to try to make the land fertile. It was very, very common for this to be absorbed by the people of the land. One thing we notice in Mahalan and Chilion is after their father Elimelech dies, what do? They take women from the land. They're already kind of culminating in. We'll find out later in the book of Ruth which brother had which wife. Mahalan is Ruth's husband. If you look over in chapter 4 and verse 20 of Ruth, turn over there with me if you will, please. Chapter 4 and verse 20. I seem to have gotten a misscripture here. Whenever Boaz is describing redeeming Ruth, he then reveals which, verse 10. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahalan, I have brought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off among his brothers from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day. When Boaz, who is going to become Ruth's husband, has made the agreement to become the Redeemer, that's when he reveals to the entire town that who Ruth's husband previously was and which brother it is. So we can find out that little bit about Mahalan, that he was the husband of Ruth and he was the son of Naomi and Elimelech. Unfortunately, we don't know much else about him. Him and his brother Chilion, who was the husband of Orpah, we find out that both of them die very quickly. We're not going to see them play a large part in this story. Turn over with me to Deuteronomy chapter 7 and verse 3, please. Deuteronomy chapter 7 and verse 3. Deuteronomy is the sermon, you might say, of Moses to the people of Israel. When he's going back over the law and how Israel should live and how they should deal with God, here's what he tells them. You shall not intermarry with them, giving your daughters to their sons, or taking their daughters for your sons. Now, what he's describing here specifically is the land of Canaan. Technically, the people of Moab were not off limits. Technically, they did not go out of bounds by taking these wives, although it wasn't what God had in mind. He had in mind for Israel to be marrying in Israel. It would be something that was not seen as what you need to do, but they technically weren't taking people out of Canaan. I want that to bring that to our attention because sometimes a lot of flack is given to Elimelech's children by taking wives from the daughters of Moab. But that is not something specifically that God forbid, even while it wasn't what he had in mind and what he intended. If the sons of Elimelech died from some evil they had committed, it was not related to that marriage. Now we get into some of the more key players in this morning's lesson, as well as in the overall story of Ruth. I really enjoy this story because it shows true love and how devotion really should be. Naomi, being the mother, the wife of Elimelech, and the mother of Mahalalel and Chilion, she showed great love not only for her husband and her sons, but also for his sons' wives. In that she is going to release them, and we'll see more about that tonight, from any duty they would have to follow her and to stay with her. She seemed by all respects to be a good mother, to be a faithful wife. Ruth, the other primary character besides Naomi, she is the example of faithfulness, the example of commitment, of true devotion and true love. She is a character that everyone in this room could take traits out of to improve our lives, not only in service to God, but to help our relationships work better among each other. And the last person that we're going to discuss this morning is Orpah. She is also a Moabite, and she is the widow of Chilion, the other son. Now, unfortunately, Orpah doesn't play as big of a role in this story because she doesn't return home with Ruth and Naomi. When Naomi is begging her daughters to go back to their mother's houses, to go back to their own families and their own gods, at first they both say no. We're going to stay with you. But Orpah decides, after she's being compelled further and further, to go ahead and turn around and go home. And we'll talk a little more about that tonight. I'm wanting us to get not only a basic idea of what happened, but also understand the gravity of this story and how beautiful this story really is. It's a story of devotion, love, faithfulness. In the midst of this time of the Judges, something I mentioned a little bit earlier, a time of social chaos, disobedience to God, oppression, deliverance, and apostasy. It's a bright light in a time of darkness. It tells the story of a Redeemer. It tells the story of someone, Boaz, stepping up and doing what was required. Something that would later be a type of Christ. Our Redeemer, our God, has done wonderful things for us. He's given us so great of blessings, not only in what we see in these different accounts and stories in the Bible, but also in His relationship to us. As we're looking through Ruth, I'm not wanting us to specifically just try to get the gist of what happened and when and where, and I realize this lesson incorporated a lot of that. But I'm wanting us to take from Ruth and Naomi those kind of hearts into ourselves. To look at this love story, this story of devotion, and to be inspired. To live as God would have us to. To be willing to be like Naomi, the mother who was looking out for what was best for her daughters-in-law. To be like Ruth, devoted, committed, connected, not letting anything separate. To help us all to be appreciative of our Redeemer, as Ruth and Naomi was for theirs. Jesus didn't have to redeem us. He didn't have to look down on us and see the sinners that we were and decide to save us. He didn't have to pay the cost, to pay the price. He could have left us in the hole that we had dug for ourselves. Just as Naomi and Elimelech didn't have to journey out to Moab. They could have stayed with the rest of the people in Bethlehem and suffered through the famine. They could have returned to God. They could have motivated the others around them to do also. They left. We've also left God. Each and every person in this room that has sinned has left God. We're waiting on Him to redeem us. He's already done the work. He's already came and provided the sacrifice. He's already paid the price. He's just waiting on us to fulfill our side of the deal. To be willing to take on that redemption. To be willing to be His. This morning, if you're here and you want to be His, don't wait another minute. Don't make Him wait. Make that commitment right now while together we stand and sing.